Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be asking the question, when was Jesus born? First, we have to look at how we got our present day calendar, and it goes back to a Scythian monk by the name of Dionysius. In the year 525 AD, Pope John I asked Dionysius, commissioned him, to try to figure out exactly when Jesus was born. The methods that they were using for dating at that point, the most common method was probably the founding of the city of Rome. That was 753 BC. That's the way we call it. So they would have called, for example, year one, they would have called that the year 754. So Dionysius tried to make that reckoning. Another way that was in use was the reign of Diocletian, was referred to by some as year one. And yet the calculations that Dionysius made were eventually used, not in his lifetime, but a couple of hundred years later. They began to be used by historians as the way to calculate what year it was, so that, for example, we can talk about the year 2021, and by that we mean that 1 AD was way back then. According to Roman time, would be the 754th year since the founding of the city of Rome. There's no year zero, so it goes from 1 AD to 1 BC as it works its way back. And the attempt was made when the calendar was finally formed to make the year of Christ's birth, AD stands for Anno Domino, the year of our Lord. That's Latin. That stands for the year one. However, more recently, calculations have been have come into effect to try to determine how accurate that was. And the way we now calculate dates, the life of Herod the Great came to an end in the year 4 BC. Notice, in the year 40 BC, he was pronounced by the Jewish Senate as King of the Jews, by the Roman Senate, I should say. And it took him a few years to get back into power. He was given a legion where it was put at his disposal, and he came back. And by the year 37, he had regained control of Palestine and then reigned until his death in spring of 4 BC. Josephus is helpful here because he mentions that at the time that, right around the season that Herod the Great died, there was a lunar eclipse, and we know that there was a partial lunar eclipse right about that time. Now, Luke chapter 2 gives a not too specific, sort of a general date as to the time of the birth of Jesus. He says, "Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This census was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, excuse me." So it's in the days of Caesar Augustus, which isn't all that helpful because he's in power for quite a long time. From we could count 31 BC, his victory over Antony at Actium, all the way down to about 15 AD. So that's a very big area. But notice the census is described as the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. That's going to help narrow it down further, but it also presents a problem. The problem with the census is that Quirinius was governor of Syria from around 6 to 7 AD. And if Herod the Great was alive at the time of Jesus, then that would have been at least 9 or 10 years prior to this. So that makes a conflict in our attempt to date the birth of Jesus. There are no earlier recorded censuses. Now, that is not necessarily evidence of anything, because just when it comes to history and archaeology, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. That's just sort of a truism, because oftentimes we have come to think, well, gee, there's no evidence that this is the case, so it must not be true. And then you run forward 20 years, and all of a sudden the evidence is discovered. So archaeology is always discovering new things. We've discovered a lot. We haven't discovered everything. We always are running short on what we have discovered. Now, there is no known census while Quirinius was governor. And so that expands the problem. It's not just the changing of the date of Jesus, but we're not exactly sure from this where to. Now, there have been several proposed solutions. I'm going to mark off some that I think are very unlikely first. It's been suggested that the passage can be translated to read, "The census was taken before Quirinius was governor of Caesar." I don't think that's a good translation personally. Another attempt has been made to translate it to say the census was before that which was taken while Quirinius was governor of Caesar. Again, that's not a natural reading of the Greek text. I think both of those are just a little forced. So, like I said, neither of these is a good translation. Another proposed solution is that the term, it should be pointed out, I think, that Luke uses a general term when he describes Quirinius and his governing of Syria. Oftentimes we see the term governor or somebody who's governing, and it's used in the New Testament by the New Testament writers in a non-technical sense. It's used in a sense where the person has authority and he is exercising rulership, but he might not necessarily hold specifically the officer of governor. He might hold some other office, some other official office, some other office that has him governing, but not strictly speaking a governor. And I think that's entirely possible in this case. If this was the first census taken, and that's what our passage says, while Quirinius was governing Syria, then we would assume, if Luke refers to it as the first census, that Luke also knows of a second census while he was governing Syria. Just the way he phrases it assumes that Luke is speaking of two different censuses, one that takes place first and one that takes place later. Now we have a inscription. It's a tombstone, actually, called the Lapis Tiburtinus, and it records the achievements of an unknown governor, a governor of Syria, who served as propraetor of Syria on two different occasions. Well, that's interesting, but what's more interesting is we have no record of any governor of Syria who served twice. You see, our records are not complete. And so, here's an unknown governor, somebody who ruled twice, but we don't know who it is. The name it's not evident on the tombstone. Quirinius did command legions in Syria after 12 BC. So he was in the area. He was exercising government authority from Rome, but not necessarily, at least insofar as we know, not necessarily having the title. So Quirinius actually might fit quite nicely into the slot. Now we have the testimony of Tertullian. He's an early church father, around 200 AD, and he states that the census of Luke chapter 2 was taken in Judea by Sentius Saturnius. He says this in his book Against Marcion. He's actually building a different case. He just mentions this in passing. And Saturnius served as the governor from 9 to 6 BC, at the same time that Quirinius was serving as a general of the legion, and therefore he's holding a position of rulership over the area, which means that he might have been referenced unofficially by Luke as, quote-unquote, governing. And again, this would fit nicely. Now, Quirinius may have overseen both, then, a first as well as a second census. So we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, but we have enough to suggest one possible solution, and it has presented itself. Now, when we come to the birth of Jesus itself and the sequence of events that are recorded, we're operating off of two primary source texts, that is the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, and we're putting those together because they each record different events, and they don't go out of their way to try to harmonize each other. They are writing independently. And as I like to mention on many occasions, two authors do not independently express thought alike. So even though they're both telling a story about the birth of Jesus, they're telling a lot of different details. They do agree on a few things. For example, they agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. They both reference that. But then Luke tells a story, presumably that day, and now I'm putting on day one, but a day or two could have passed. We read about the shepherds visiting. The angels show up and tell the shepherds, go to the place and you're going to see the baby lying in a manger. And they do that, and the baby is there. And they see that. Then Luke also mentions 8 days later that Jesus is circumcised and given his name, because it was customary that you didn't actually name the child until the 8th day. At the time of his circumcision, he would become both a child of the covenant, but he would also be now given his name, his Jewish name. Next, and this normally took place after 40 days, where you would have a woman who had given birth to her firstborn had to go through both a cleansing ritual, and also they would go and they would redeem the child. And this was a ceremony that would take place, like I said, after 40 days. So I put it here 41 days later, could have been 42, 43 or more, but at least after 40 days. And this is recorded in Luke chapter 2, verses 22 through 38. Where Mary and Joseph, they present Jesus in the temple, and remember they have an encounter, one with Anna, a woman there in the temple, and another with a elderly man by the name of Simeon who'd been waiting for the coming of the Messiah, and both of these encounters are recorded in Luke's account. Next, after this, and we don't know exactly how long, we have the Magi coming to Bethlehem. This is recorded in Matthew chapter 2, their story. Now, some people will often say, well, this happens 2 years later. Where they're getting that is that Herod the Great orders that all the children 2 years old and younger are to be killed. But if Herod had understood Jesus to be 2 years old, he would have called for all 2-year-old children to be put to death. I think he's giving himself a safety margin. Or else he might have said all children, maybe 4 or 5 years old and younger, to be put to death, so that he would be sure to get this particular child. So I think the idea here is probably that Jesus was still very young, maybe 41, 42, 43 days old, maybe a day or two after Mary and Joseph having taken him to be presented in the temple at that very young age. But I don't think he was much older than that. I think he was still what we would call an infant. Now, the next question we have is in what season was Jesus born? And here it's been pointed out sometimes that you have shepherds. Remember, they're in the fields watching their flocks by night. I've actually heard some people claim, well, shepherds didn't watch their sheep out in the fields in the wintertime, that they would have been indoors. The problem with that is that they would be tended in the wilderness. Remember, they didn't tend their sheep in cultivated areas like right around Jerusalem. They would have been over the rise and down into the wilderness area, which is to the east of Bethlehem, maybe a mile, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles, and you're going downhill all the way as you cross that ridge and move to the east. You're finding yourself going down toward the Dead Sea, and the further east you go, the warmer it gets. So yes, shepherds did back then, and still today can be out in, for example, in December and January. Now that is the rainy season. That's also the cold area, but it's a Mediterranean climate. So they did graze their sheep year round. And in fact, if you go to Israel today, you'll still see them doing it, and usually in the same area, usually down in the wilderness area as you go down toward the Dead Sea and toward the Jordan Rift Valley. Now, Israel is located in a Mediterranean climate. That means that compared to other parts of the world, the winters are not too extreme, It doesn't mean it never snows. It can. But as a general rule, the winters are relatively mild. The summers are relatively, especially up in the hills, are relatively cool. It doesn't get too hot, although I've seen it very hot. For example, up by the Sea of Galilee, I've seen it hit 110 degrees. But that's rare. That's breaking all sorts of records. And so usually you have a relatively mild climate. Now, there have been attempts to follow the priestly cycle as we look at Zacharias. Remember, the announcement is made to him early in Luke's gospel, and we're told that he is a priest of the division of Abijah. There were 24 divisions or 24 courses into which the priesthood had been separated. This had happened way back in the days of David and Solomon, and these divisions served a rotation. But it was a rotation that was done twice a year. So if you can accurately do this, I'm not sure that you can, but if you could if it had to be in that division, then that still gives you once every 6 months that this would take place. And added to that is the problem that all of the divisions were present at special feast days. So that's going to give us a number of other times when this could possibly have taken place. We're not told further that Elizabeth became pregnant that very day, so it might have taken a day or a week or a few weeks before Elizabeth becomes pregnant. We don't know exactly, when. I don't think it took, 6 months or anything like that. But again, trying to determine that exactly can be all problematic. In the year AD 274, the Roman Emperor Aurelian established an observance described as Sol Invictus. And this was a celebration that was set on December 25th. And it's become popular to think that Christians just borrowed that date. And they said, well, that's the day that we're going to remember the birth of Jesus because it's a convenient day. It's already being used for a Roman celebration, and we'll just make that the birth of Jesus. So the question is, did Christians choose this day to celebrate, or did the Roman emperor choose this date because the Christians were celebrating it and he wanted to replace it with something pagan? You see, which came first? Did Aurelian choose this day to overshadow Christianity, or did the Christians choose this day because pagans were already celebrating? Remember, this is at a time when Christianity technically was still illegal, and Christians were not going out of their way to try to adopt pagan customs. That would happen a few hundred years later, but that wasn't the case at this point in history. And Ambrose is interesting. He describes Jesus as the true sun. The celebration of Sol Invictus was looking at how the sun, in the winter months, if you're in the northern hemisphere, it gets your daylight hours grow less and less and less until around December. It's actually December 21st, and then it begins to grow brighter. And Ambrose describes Jesus as the true sun, in contrast to that Sol Invictus, which was a false god. So perhaps he's pointing out, look, even though Jesus was born around that time, he's the true sun, and that other celebration is the false one. The Donatists, this was a Christian splinter group. They held that December 25th was the date of the birth of Jesus. Now, they come to that conclusion around 300 AD, so it's a bit after this. But I don't think they were taking pagan dates to choose from, because they were actually upset at some of the Christians who had done things like under threat of persecution, either had renounced Jesus or who had, in some cases, run away from persecution. And Donatists had said, you're not supposed to run away, you're supposed to stand there and get persecuted. So the idea of them adopting something pagan would be very much not like them. If anything, they tended to go to the opposite extreme. There's a Jewish tradition that says that great thing happens in the month of Nisan. Nisan's the first month of the Jewish religious year. When you talk about the Jewish New Year, you always have to ask, are you talking about the religious year or the secular year? The secular year actually comes from Babylon. It's something that the Jewish people picked up while they were in Babylon. So that when you hear your Jewish friends refer to Rosh Hashanah, that's in around August or September. That's something the Babylonians did. In the Old Testament, New Year was never ever in the fall. It was always at Nisan in the spring, around what we refer to as March or April. Their months don't line up exactly with ours. And so they would, actually, Jewish tradition taught that the creation of the world had been at Nisan, which is how you started the months, that the birth of Isaac took place. Now, I'm not saying the Bible says this. I'm saying this was Jewish tradition, that Passover, and Passover did take place at that point, so that the birth of the nation of Israel took place on Nisan. And of course, that was celebrated each and every year. But they also taught, this was, again, a Jewish tradition. Now, it's a later tradition. I'm not sure exactly when it came into effect. But they taught that the coming of redemption for the world would take place, and they said it hadn't happened yet, that it would take place in Nisan as well. And so you say, well, wait a minute, Jesus was crucified at Passover, so on the month of Nisan. That actually works. But think also, and this is just happenstance, this is by no means evidence, but it's an interesting point, that if indeed the Holy Spirit came upon Mary at this time of the year, then 9 months later would have been sometime in what we refer to as December. So again, that December 25th tradition might fit. Of course, it could have been some other time. And so when I'm asked in what season was Jesus born, my answer is we don't know. We really don't know. And so people have made all sorts of guesses, and we just have to say the important thing is not when he was born or what season he was born, but that he did come into the world, and that Jesus was born. The Word became flesh and lived among us.